I saw it happen. I was standing 12 rows back in the conclave hall, close enough that the torchlight caught the gold stitching on his ceremonial cloak, close enough that I heard the silence before the words. That particular silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums because 1,000 people are holding their breath at once. I saw her face when he said it, and I have never, in 30 years of watching the powerful do what the powerful do, felt the air go out of a room the way it went out that day. This is the story of what he said, and what it cost him, and what she did with the wreckage. Her name was Alara. She was not what you would call remarkable if you were the kind of person who measured worth in bloodlines and dowry weight. Daughter of a millwright in the outer settlement of Vethara, one of 14 pack villages that owed fealty to the Iron Throne without ever expecting to be noticed by it. She had her mother's hands, wide across the knuckles, calloused at the base of every finger, and a scar that ran from the corner of her left eye to her jaw, thin as a seam, pale against her brown skin. An accident from childhood. A cartwheel, they said. She never bothered to correct people who called it ugly. She had stopped explaining herself to people who hadn't asked a real question. She was 23 when she came to the conclave. Not by invitation, not by anything so straightforward as that. She came because the mating pull had been building for 4 months. A low, relentless pressure behind her sternum, like a hand pressing inward, like something trying to get out, and she had followed it the way any wolf follows the thing that calls to them in the marrow, across 2 mountain passes. On foot, the last 60 miles. Because her horse went lame outside Karen's Ford, and she had spent her last coin on the ferryman. She arrived at the gates of the Iron Citadel with road dust in her hair, and a split on her bottom lip from the cold, and the guards laughed. She did not, which was the first thing anyone should have noticed. Inside the conclave hall, the Alpha King Rowan of the Iron Throne was completing his 17th year of rule. He was not the tallest man in the room, though people who wrote about him later often added inches he did not have. He was broad through the chest and long in the jaw, with a single white streak running through his dark hair above his left temple, not from age, but from a wound he'd taken at 19 that had left a thread of scar tissue underneath. He moved through rooms the way water moves through channels. Inevitably, without visible effort, finding the lowest pressure point, without appearing to look for it. He felt it the moment she walked in. You have to understand what that means, for those of you who have never carried a mate bond without knowing it. It does not arrive like a recognition. It arrives like a blow. One moment the world is arranged the way it has always been arranged, and the next moment there is a direction. A specific, absolute, nauseating direction. The way a compass needle doesn't choose north. It simply cannot be anything else. He was in conversation with Lord Vale of the Eastern Marches. Vale, with his flat gray eyes and his habit of touching his own ring when he wanted someone to remember he had allies. When Rowan's head turned, just slightly, toward the far doors, toward her, Lord Vale noticed. Of course he noticed. Vale noticed everything that might be useful. What Rowan did next is the part I have turned over for 30 years, trying to find a version of it that makes sense. Trying to find the moment where a different choice was still available, where the door was still open from both sides. I have not found it. I think by the time she crossed the threshold, it was already too late for him. Not because the bond was irreversible, but because he had already made a different promise. One that had nothing to do with fate, and everything to do with politics and pride. The conclave of kings met once every 5 years. Every pack lord, every territorial alpha, every warlord with enough wolves to demand a seat. They all came, and for 17 years, Rowan had held this room together by being the thing everyone feared slightly more than they feared each other. He had done it with military alliances and trade agreements and, yes, with the strategic understanding that his mating would be the single most destabilizing event in a generation. Whoever he bonded would carry the weight of the Iron Throne. Every pack lord in that hall had a daughter, a niece, a cousin, and they had been watching him for 17 years, with the particular hunger of people who knew exactly what was at stake. He had promised, not in writing, not formally, but in the way that men like Rowan promise things, with sustained eye contact and a steady voice, and the implicit understanding that the Iron Throne did not make promises it did not intend to keep. He had spent 3 years building an agreement with the Northern Conclave, whose strength lay in their numbers, and whose price for allegiance had been, from the beginning, a name on his arm. Specifically, the name of Saren of the North. Saren was 26, with ice-pale hair she wore in a single braid over one shoulder, and the kind of composed expression that came from being trained, from childhood, to show nothing. She was not cruel. I want to be precise about that. She was not warm either. She was competent and political, and she had understood her role since before she could articulate it. And there was something in her eyes, in unguarded moments, that looked less like ambition and more like exhaustion. She was already in the hall when Alara arrived. She was watching Rowan when his head turned. And Alara, still at the far doors, still shaking road dust from her cloak, still drawing the sharp-edged attention of people who knew she did not belong. Alara felt it, too. The direction, the compass. She looked up, across 300 feet of packed bodies and torchlight and politics, and she found him without searching. They looked at each other for 4 seconds. I counted. I was watching. 4 seconds, and then a lord's wife stepped into the sight line, and the moment broke, and I watched Rowan's jaw tighten, and his chin come up, and his eyes go very deliberate and controlled. The way you look at something you have already decided not to want. She came forward. Because the pull was insistent, and she had walked 60 miles, and she was not the kind of woman who stopped before the last step. She threaded through the crowd. People moved out of her way without meaning to. Some wolf instinct, some awareness that she was moving with intent. She stopped 12 feet from him, because the guards were there, and because she had enough sense to understand she was nowhere near where she was supposed to be. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you recognize and have no good solution for. "Alpha King," she said. Her voice was steady. I have never forgotten that, whatever she felt, and she must have felt it crashing through her, the bond singing in every nerve she had. Her voice was steady. "I believe you know why I've come." The room which had been talking had gone quiet. Rooms go quiet around power. They go quieter around rupture. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, and this is the part I have never been able to explain, because I saw his face, and for one fraction of a second, less than a second, barely long enough to name, something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not controlled, not political, not the Alpha King at all, just a man. Looking at the person the universe had pointed him toward. Then it was gone. "I know your face," he said. "I do not know your name," she told him. "Alara. Daughter of male, millwright, Vethara settlement." She said it clearly. The way you say a thing you are not ashamed of. Someone laughed, not loudly, but it carried. Rowan did not look at the person who laughed. He kept his eyes on Alara, and here is where I will tell you what I believed for a long time and have since revised. I believed, watching him, that what came next was coldness, calculation. That he had simply looked at her and weighed her and found her wanting, the way powerful men weigh the powerless and find the math easy. I was wrong, and I was right. Both, in the way that the most damaging things are usually both. "The Iron Throne," Rowan said, and his voice was the Alpha King's voice now, carrying to every corner, reaching the 31st row where I stood, does not recognize mating claims from unverified origins during conclave proceedings. A pause. Deliberate. Long enough for the room to understand what was coming. Any bond pull experienced in this hall by unbonded wolves will be referred to the pack registry for formal assessment. That process takes. He turned, briefly, to one of his stewards. A man named Davin who had served the throne for 12 years, and whose hands, I noticed, were clasped too tightly behind his back. 60 days, at minimum. He was not saying no. He was saying not you, in a language formal enough to be deniable. She understood him perfectly. The hall understood him perfectly. And because Alara was Alara, she didn't cry. She didn't plead. She looked at him with those dark eyes, the left one bisected by that thin, pale scar, the one that ran from eye to jaw, and she said quietly enough that only the closest people heard, 60 days. I see. She turned and she walked back toward the doors. And that should have been enough. For Rowan's purposes, that should have been sufficient. A quiet dismissal, a procedural deflection, something that could be filed and forgotten while he signed whatever treaty required Saren's name beside his own. But Lord Vale, with his flat gray eyes and his strategic instincts and his absolute inability to leave well enough alone, had a different idea. He stepped into the center of the floor. He did not raise his voice. He simply said it at a volume that guaranteed it would be heard by every lord and lady and pack alpha in the room. A millwright's daughter. She walked from Vethara on foot, I'm told, arrived at the Citadel gates this morning with nothing but road filth and a faded mate story. He smiled. The kind of smile that does not involve warmth. The Alpha King's mate. Imagine. The laughter this time was not one person. Alara stopped walking. She stood with her back to the room, and I could see the line of her shoulders, and I watched her breathe in once. A visible expansion, a deliberate, controlled thing, and then she turned around. She did not look at Vale. She looked at Rowan. And Rowan, the Alpha King, the man who held this room together by being the thing everyone feared more than they feared each other. Rowan met her eyes. And he did the thing that I will never forgive him for, even though I have spent 30 years trying to understand it. He said nothing. He could have silenced Vale. He could have shut it down with 2 words. He was the Alpha King. The room would have obeyed him. But he had a treaty to protect and a room full of pack lords to manage, and 17 years of strategic credibility to maintain. And so he stood there, and he let the laughter happen. And then he looked away from her. That was the rejection. Not the procedural deflection. Not the 60 days, the looking away. I think she knew it too. Because what crossed her face in that moment was not devastation. I have seen devastation. I know its shape. It was something quieter and more permanent. It was the expression of a person who has just learned the exact shape of a thing and will not forget it. She walked out of the conclave hall. She did not look back. The doors closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. In my 30 years of watching the powerful do what the powerful do, I have never seen a door close so absolutely. What I am going to tell you now is 2 stories happening at the same time, pulling in opposite directions, and I want you to hold both. One story, what Rowan built and what it cost him. The other story, what Alara made in the space he left. He married Saren of the North in the 3rd month after the conclave. The ceremony was in the Citadel's main hall, and it was exactly as impressive as it needed to be. The right lords attended. The right words were said. Rowan stood at the altar with the careful steadiness he brought to everything. And when he looked at Saren, he was not unkind. That matters. He was not unkind. He placed her name on his arm with the solemnity he brought to all public acts, and he said what he had agreed to say, and Saren said what she had been prepared to say, and it was, by every measurable standard, a successful alliance. The treaty held. The Northern Pact signed. The Iron Throne's western border stabilized within the 1st season. Everything worked, exactly as he had calculated it would, and the bond burned. That is not a metaphor. Or, it is, but it is also not. Severed mate bonds do not die. This is something the powerful learn, sometimes, at extreme personal cost. You can reject a bond publicly, can invoke the Alpha King's right to refuse a fated pull on political grounds, can file the forms and say the words, and stand in front of 1,000 witnesses, and the bond will remain. Not as a pull toward a person, as an absence, as a wound in the shape of where the pull used to be, a phantom ache, a cold place in the chest that refuses to warm, that ordinary fires cannot reach. Rowan had known this was possible. He had, in his due diligence, consulted 3 of the 4 surviving bond scholars in the known territories. The 4th was unreachable, which he had filed under acceptable uncertainty. He had not fully believed the reports. He believed them now. The bond absence felt like. He told no one this. But I have pieced it together from the accounts of those who served him closely during that year. It felt like breathing with one lung. Not impossible. Not immediately fatal. Just perpetually insufficient. In a way that accumulated day by day, like a slow leak no amount of patchwork could fix. He could not smell certain things anymore. This is the detail that broke him, I think, slowly, without his permission. The mate bond carries scent awareness, a sharpening of the wolf senses toward a single person, a deepening of the world's texture through smell. When the bond was severed, that sharpening reversed. The world went slightly, irreversibly flat. Food tasted correct but not good. Wood smoke smelled functional but not grounding. The sharp green of rain on stone, which had once anchored him in moments of stress, it faded, not gone, just muted. Like hearing music through a wall. Saren noticed. Of course she noticed. She was not a fool, and she was not in love with him, and she had understood her role too precisely to pretend she didn't see what was happening. "You're fading," she said to him, 5 months in. They were in his study. The smaller one, the one he used for work rather than performance, with its stacks of territorial maps and its single window that looked north. She was standing at the window. She had a habit of standing at windows, Saren, always orienting toward distance, toward the direction of home. "I'm tired," he said. She turned from the window, looked at him directly, her ice-pale braid over one shoulder, her composed expression, and underneath it, that particular exhaustion I had first noticed in the conclave hall. "Roan," she said. Just his name, flat and precise. He looked up. "I know about the bond pull," she said. "I knew at the conclave. I watched your head turn." She paused. "I did not ask you to do what you did. I want that to be clear between us." He was quiet for a long time. In the hearth, the fire shifted, popped once. "The alliance. The alliance would have found another way," she said. "Alliances always do. That is what alliances are for." She turned back to the window. "I am telling you this not because I need your guilt. I have enough of my own. I am telling you because whatever you think you preserved, you should look at it carefully." She did not say, "You severed the wrong thing," but she didn't need to. He stayed in the study for a long time after she left. I think of him there, sometimes, with his territorial maps and his insufficient lung and his muted world. I think of him understanding, with the cold precision that made him a good king and a poor human, that he had not made a calculation error. He had made a different kind of mistake entirely. A mistake that cannot be corrected with strategy. The marriage did not collapse all at once. It unraveled, which is worse in some ways, because unraveling has no clean moment to point to, no event that functions as cause. It unraveled the way a treaty unravels, when the underlying interests diverge past the point where language can paper over them, slowly, then unmistakably. Saren was not unhappy, exactly. She was present in all the ways that were required and absent in all the ways that were privately necessary. She sent letters north at regular intervals. She was gracious at court functions. She did not complain, and she did not ask for things she was not given, and she wore the mark of his name with the composure she brought to everything. And 4 months before the year was out, she came to him with a document, not a treaty, a proposal. He read it in front of her, 3 pages. Precise, lawyerly, with none of the language of emotion, entirely in the grammar of practicality. She proposed a formal dissolution of the bond on grounds of incompatibility of wolf nature, which was a recognized provision in the Iron Throne's own charter. She had already spoken with 2 of the bond scholars. She proposed that the Northern Alliance be restructured. She had outlined the restructuring in an appendix, on the basis of trade rights and territorial guarantees rather than mating bonds, which she argued, with specific historical citations, were an unstable foundation for geopolitical agreements under any circumstances. She had put in a footnote in smaller script at the bottom of the last page. It read, "You are not a bad man, Rowan. You are a man who made a choice he cannot undo with more choices. I have made my own. They are not punishments. They are just doors." He looked up from the document. She was watching him with those ice-pale eyes and her single braid and the exhaustion she no longer tried to hide. "The Northern Lords," he started. "Will accept it," she said. "I have spoken with my father. He is pragmatic." A pause. "More pragmatic than either of us has been." He signed the document. He did not try to argue her out of it. I think, in some corner of himself that had been very quiet for a long time, he had been waiting for her to be the one to say it, which was its own kind of cowardice, the kind that wears the costume of respect. The dissolution was announced to the court as mutual and amicable, which was true, and as a restructuring of alliance terms, which was also true, and there was a great deal of diplomatic language deployed around it that meant, essentially, this did not work, and we are being adults about it. The Northern Pax did not go to war. The trade agreements held. Saren returned north with her braid and her documents and her footnote, and she was, by all accounts, significantly less exhausted within a season. And Rowan stood in the restructured arrangement of his life. The treaty remade. The marriage dissolved. The wound in the shape of the bond still there. Still cold, still muting the world. And he understood at last the precise nature of what he had done. He had not saved anything. He had traded her for a version of stability that collapsed anyway. He had stood in the conclave hall and looked away from a woman walking out of a door. And the door had kept on closing, and the bond had kept on aching, and the world had kept on going flat. And for what? For a marriage that lasted less than a year. For an alliance his own estranged wife had restructured from scratch in 3 pages and an appendix. He thought about Ilara for the first time, with something other than suppression. He wondered where she had gone. Here is what Rowan did not know. Here is what I did not know, that autumn when the dissolution was announced and the court began its careful, calibrated management of the narrative. I did not know she had gone back to Vithara. I did not know she had spent 40 days there, in her mother's house, in a room with a low ceiling and a single window, and that she had done nothing outwardly dramatic in those 40 days. No scenes, no declarations. She had helped her father with the mill. She had eaten meals. She had slept on the nights when the Bond Act permitted it. And at the end of those 40 days, she had left. Not in flight. In decision. She had gone east to the city of Marin's Crossing, a guild city, prosperous and independent, one of the 3 cities in the known territories that operated under its own charter, and answered to no pack lord and no alpha king. She had arrived with very little. Her skills were physical. She knew how to work with her hands. She knew machinery. She had her father's millwright knowledge built into muscle and instinct. She apprenticed herself to a woman named Ossian, who was the only licensed mechanical bonder in the Eastern Territories. Ossian was 62 years old and had 3 fingers missing on her right hand from a gear shaft accident, and the sharpest eyes I have ever looked into, like chips of dark glass. She did not take apprentices. She had said so publicly on multiple occasions. She took Ilara after a single conversation. She never explained why. Exactly. Ossian was not a woman who explained herself. But I asked her, once, years later, what it was, and she said, "She asked the right question. I asked what the question was." Ossian smiled, and it rearranged her entire face. She asked what the machine was trying to do, not what it did, what it was trying to do. She picked up her coffee, Ossian drank her coffee with a spoon of salt, which I have never tried to replicate. And she took a sip and said, "Most people never ask that." Alara spent 3 years with Ossian, learning the mechanical bonding craft, which I should explain. It was the practice of applying bond theory, the same principles that govern mate bonds, pack bonds, the invisible architecture of wolf connection, to physical structures. Mills, bridges, aquifer systems, the application of living bond principles to inert materials, to make them stronger at their joints than their component parts. It was new enough that most of the territories hadn't caught up to it yet. It was old enough that Ossian had built half the guild city's infrastructure with it. By the end of the first year, Alara could reconstruct a water diversion system from component parts in 4 hours. By the end of the second year, she had designed one herself, improving on the existing model in 2 specific ways that Ossian made her defend in front of the guild review board. With their clipboards, and their skeptical faces, and their unspoken assumption that this was the millwright's daughter, who'd had some fanciful business at the conclave, that one time. She defended it calmly. She answered every question directly. She had prepared for the hostile ones. She passed. The third year, she took on her first independent commission. A river settlement 2 days south of Marin's Crossing, whose mill had been failing for a decade, whose pack had tried 3 outside contractors and found them wanting. They hired Alara on Ossian's recommendation, and a flat fee and a verbal promise that if she didn't solve the problem within a season, they owed her nothing. She solved it in 6 weeks. The mill ran better than it had in a generation. The pack elder, a blunt, broad man named Talver, who had hands like Alara's and a permanent expression of mild disbelief, wrote her a letter of testimony that used the phrase, verbatim. She asked the machine what it was trying to do, and then she let it. He sent it to the guild with his seal on it. Other commissions followed. Word moved in the way that useful things move, which is faster and more thoroughly than news. Within 2 years of passing the guild review, Alara had completed 7 commissions, had an apprentice of her own, a 16-year-old named Bryn, who was missing an earlobe and had the particular quality of focused silence that made difficult work easier, and had been twice cited in the guild's quarterly report as a practitioner of note. She was, in the language of that world and that city, a name. Not famous, not a lord's name, not a court name, but in the guild cities and the outer settlements and the river packs who needed their infrastructure to work and had stopped caring where the expertise came from. Alara of Vethara was the person you sent for. She had rebuilt herself. From the road dust and the split lip and the laughter in the conclave hall, she had rebuilt herself into someone specific and solid and needed, in a way that had nothing to do with fate or bonds or alpha kings. I want to be precise about this, because it matters for everything that comes after. She did not do it for him. She did not do it to punish him, or to prove something to him, or to be ready for him when he finally came, because some part of her was keeping score. She did it because there was nothing else to do, and because she was the kind of person who, when handed wreckage, asks what the wreckage was trying to become. The Bondak never left. I will not lie to you about that. She felt it in the joints of her hands on cold mornings. She felt it in the particular silence of sleeping alone in a city that was not her city, not yet, not quite. There were nights, not many, but some, when the ache was not in her hands but in her chest, in that place where the bond had been, the place the rejection had carved out, and she lay in the dark of her small rented room above the guild workshop, and she felt it, and she let herself feel it, and then she got up in the morning, and she went to work. She did not pine, but she was not untouched. The difference matters. She was 26 years old, and she had a commission on the Western River Road, and an apprentice who asked good questions, and a mentor who kept her coffee salted, and she had, for the first time in her adult life, the specific satisfaction of being known for something she had made with her own hands. She was not waiting. and that is, the thing Rowan had not understood, and would not understand until he found her, and it would unsettle him more completely than any enemy he had ever faced. He spent 4 months after the dissolution trying to locate her through official channels, which tells you something about him, that his first instinct, even then, was procedural. The pack registry, the settlement records, a formal inquiry through the outer village network, nothing. Vithara's records showed she had left 3 years prior, destination unspecified. He shut down that search after 6 weeks, telling himself it was dignity. Telling himself that a man who had done what he had done did not deserve the ease of a formal search. That if he was going to find her, he would have to do it the way she had come to him, on his own feet. He told his steward Davin, the man with the clasped hands, who had been with the throne through all of it, and who had never once said, "I told you so," which was either loyalty or a very precise form of cruelty, that he would be traveling east on a personal matter. Devon looked at him for a long moment. "The Eastern Territories," Devon said. "Not a question." "The Guild Cities," Rowan said. Another pause. "Shall I arrange an escort, my lord?" "No." Davin's hands clasped tighter. "An alias, then." Rowan looked at him. "Would it help?" "No," Davin said. "But it might slow the gossip." He arrived in Marin's Crossing in the early morning, when the Guild City was just waking, when the workshop fires were being lit and the smell of metal and morning bread moved through the streets together. He had taken Davin's advice and worn plain wool rather than the ceremonial weight of court dress, and without the gold stitching and the ceremonial cloak, he was just a broad-shouldered man with a white streak in his hair, which meant he was recognized by roughly 1/3 of the people he passed, instead of all of them. He found Ossian first. Her workshop was not hard to locate. It was the building with the largest gear mechanism visible through the open double doors. A piece of engineering so purposefully intricate, it looked like a statement of intent. Ossian was at her work table when he walked in. She looked up, looked at him with those dark glass eyes, and went back to what she was doing. "She's on the Westers Road," Ossian said, without being asked. "Commission at the Lauren River settlement. She'll be back by week's end." She paused, made an adjustment to whatever was in her hands. "She doesn't know you're here. How do you?" He started. "Because if she knew," Ossian said in a tone that required no elaboration, "she wouldn't be coming back by week's end." He found lodging near the guild quarter. He waited. He did something he had not done in 17 years of ruling, which was nothing in a small room, without advisors or stewards or the weight of other people's needs pressing at him. He sat with the cold place in his chest and the muted world, and on the second morning he stood at his small window and smelled the rain on the city stones, and it was, not there, the green sharpness, still muted, still wrong. On the third day, he went to the guild market and he ate something that tasted only correct. On the fourth day, she came back. He was at the market square when she walked in from the western road, and I know this because there was a woman who sold cloth at the eastern edge of the square, and she told me, later, that she saw his face before he saw Alara, and that his face in that moment was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a man of power. Then Alara walked in. She was dusty from the road. She had a leather satchel of tools slung across one shoulder, and the apprentice, Bryn, half a step behind her. She walked with the specific efficiency of someone who has been moving all day and knows exactly where they're going. She was speaking to Bryn as she walked. Something technical, something about load tolerances, and Bryn was nodding with that focused silence. Rowan stepped into her path. She stopped. 3 feet of distance. 3 feet and the whole market between them and the Bondak, and this is what he told someone, later, who told someone, who eventually told me. The Bondak stopped. Not healed, not restored. Just, for the first time in a year, quiet. Like a held breath finally let go. She looked at him. He had rehearsed things to say. He had, in 4 days of waiting, composed several versions of an opening sentence. Every one of them died. "Alara," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Bryn, beside her, looked between them and had the excellent instinct to take a very large step sideways. "Alpha King," she said. Her voice was exactly what it had been in the conclave hall. Steady. He flinched, slightly. She saw it. "My name is Rowan," he said. "I know what your name is," she said. And then she walked around him and continued toward the guild quarter. And he stood in the market square with the bond temporarily quiet. And the world still muted, watching her go, and understood that the next part was going to be considerably harder than finding her. She did not run. That was important to her. She had decided it in the first moment of seeing him, when the bond had gone quiet and her hands had, traitorously, gone slightly unsteady in their grip on the satchel strap. She would not run from him. Running implied something to run from. She simply went where she had been going, because she had somewhere to be. Bryn caught up with her outside the guild quarter. "That was," Bryn said carefully, "a very well-known person." "Yes," Alara said. "Should I?" "No," she said. Then, more gently, "The report for Talver needs to go out by morning. Can you start the transcription?" Bryn went. Alara stood outside Ossian's workshop and let herself have 30 seconds, which was what she allowed herself. 30 seconds of standing still with her eyes closed, and the satchel strap in her steady hands, and the sound of the city around her, the smell of metal and evening fires. Someone frying something with onions 3 streets over. She breathed in. Out. Then she went inside. Ossian was at her work table. She did not look up. "He's staying at the guild lodging house," Ossian said. "I know," Alara said. "Are you going to see him?" A pause. The workshop was warm from the day's fires, and it smelled of metal and oil, and the faint sweetness of the pine resin Ossian used to seal joint work, and Alara stood in it and felt it grounding her, the way she had learned to let her surroundings do when the ache got complicated. "He came here," she said finally, "so yes. Eventually." She set down her satchel, began unpacking her tools in the order she always unpacked them, on my terms. Ossian, at her work table, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was not one. He came to the workshop the next morning. She made him wait 20 minutes, not because she was being strategic, but because she was in the middle of something that required concentration. And the 20 minutes was real. And when she came out, she found him standing in the doorway of the workshop, in his plain wool, looking at the large gear mechanism with the expression of someone who had just been told something they didn't entirely understand but had decided was important. "It's a demonstration piece," she said. "Ossian uses it to explain load bonding to people who haven't seen it before." He looked at her, then back at the mechanism. "How does it work?" She had not expected that question. She had prepared for other questions, for apologies, for explanations, for the careful language of a man who had spent a year composing what he would say. She had not prepared for genuine curiosity. She told him, briefly, the principles, how the bond theory applied to mechanical joints, how the strength came from the connection points, not the components. He listened in the way that people who have learned to exercise power listen, with a stillness that looks passive and isn't. When she finished, he said, "I've been trying to think of what to say to you for 4 months. "I know," she said. "Nothing I've composed is sufficient." "I know that too," she said. She folded her arms, looked at him evenly. "Say it anyway." He did. He did not, to his credit and her faint surprise, tell her he loved her. He did not claim the bond. He did not invoke fate or the mating pull or any of the gravitational language that would have made the conversation easier for him and more manipulable for her. He said, "I stood in that hall and I let that happen, and I knew, even while it was happening, that it was wrong. Not politically wrong. Wrong. And I didn't stop it because I had already decided, before you walked in, what I was going to do. And I had enough pride to follow through on a decision I had already made." even when the decision became something I couldn't justify. He stopped. He swallowed, twice. "I'm not here to ask you to restore the bond," he said. "I'm not here to ask you for anything. I came because I needed to. I needed you to know that I see it, what I did. I see it clearly, and I will not offer you excuses for it." She was quiet. The workshop was warm. The gear mechanism turned slightly in the draft from the door. "That's more than I expected," she said. And because she was Alara, and because she had spent 3 years building herself into someone who could say true things in difficult moments. "It's not enough." He nodded. He had not expected it to be enough. "I know," he said. He left. He came back the next day, not with more words, but because she was at the guild market assessing materials for a commission, and he happened to be in the guild market, or he appeared to be happening to be in the guild market, and he did not try to speak with her. He simply was present, in the way that the first step of something difficult is simply being present. She noticed. She said nothing. He came back the day after, and she was repairing a piece of equipment outside the workshop. A small thing, a calibration problem, the kind of work that requires both hands and all the attention. And he walked past and he stopped and he said, "The left join is carrying too much of the load." She looked up. He looked at the equipment, not at her. "The tension's uneven. It'll hold for now, but it'll fail at the join under heavy use." She looked at the join. He was correct. She didn't tell him he was correct. She adjusted the join without acknowledging that the observation had been useful, and he watched her work for 30 seconds and then he said, quietly, "I'll leave you to it." And he did. She sat back on her heels and looked at the adjusted join and felt, with some irritation, that this was not going in the direction she had planned. The days accumulated, not dramatically. He did not court her with grand gestures. She would have found grand gestures easier to resist. He was simply present, consistently, with a quality of attention that did not demand anything in return. He showed up at the guild market. He ate at the same stall she ate at separate tables, and he did not manufacture excuses to speak with her, but he was there when she looked up. Once, he helped Bryn carry materials from the market to the workshop. Bryn, who was 16 and had no political instincts, said thank you, and told him earnestly that the load bonding technique was the most interesting thing Bryn had ever learned. And Rowan said, with what appeared to be genuine interest, "How does it work?" And they had an entire conversation about it, while Alara walked ahead of them both and felt something terribly inconvenient shifting in her chest. She refused to call it softening. She would call it reassessment. But she also knew, with the honesty she had promised herself 3 years ago in a low, silenced room in Vathara, that the bond ache was quiet when he was near. Not healed, not resolved. Just still, the way a wound stops hurting when pressure is gently applied. And she knew, with the same honesty, that this was not why she was reassessing him. She was reassessing him because he had changed, and she was someone who paid attention to things that were changing. She was also reassessing him because she had done something one evening that she had not planned to do. He had been at the workshop. Ossian had invited him, which was information in itself, because Ossian did not invite people, and they had been talking about the Lauren River Commission, and Alara had been explaining the problem with the old mill's central shaft. And she had picked up a piece of chalk and drawn the load diagram on the workshop's planning board without thinking about it, and he had leaned in to look at it, and he had been close enough that she could feel the warmth of him on her left side, the arm nearest to him, and she had kept drawing and her hand had not shaken, but it had been a near thing. She made herself a decision, that night in her room above the guild workshop, with the lamp burning low and the tools on the work table and the sound of the city below. She would tell him, once, clearly, exactly what she was and was not willing to consider. She would not couch it in softness or strategy. She would say it the way she said everything, directly and only once. She found him the next morning at the market. 3 things, she said. She did not sit. She stood across the market stall from him in the noise and the morning, and the smell of fresh bread from the baker's 2 stalls over. I'll say them once. He put down what he was holding. He gave her his entire attention. First, the bond does not determine what I decide. It is a fact, like gravity. I can feel it, and it does not make my choices for me. What I decide. He nodded. Second, what you did in that hall was not just to me. You let that room do what it did to me. You could have stopped it, and you chose not to, and that choice had a cost, and the cost was real, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I will not pretend it was smaller than it was. He was very still. Third, she paused, just for a moment. I am not the woman who walked into that hall. I am not waiting for anything or anyone. What I've built here is mine, and I will not dissolve it for a bond or a throne or anything else. If something is going to happen between us, it happens on ground that is level. Not on ground where I owe you gratitude for choosing me when you chose me. A pause. The market moved around them. Those are my terms, she said. I told you I would say them once. He looked at her for a long time. The white streak above his left temple, the jaw, the steadiness that she had once read as coldness and now read as something more complicated. All right, he said. She looked at him. Those are fair terms, he said. More than fair. He picked back up what he had put down. It was an apple, a green one, slightly too firm, the kind the market sold at the end of season, and he turned it once in his hand. Is there a 4th, or are we working with 3? Something entirely involuntary happened to her face. Not a smile, exactly, but the precursor to one, the thing that happens in the muscles around the mouth before the decision is made. She turned and walked back toward the workshop. She heard him behind her quietly. I'll take that as 3. 2 months in Marin's Crossing. He had rearranged his affairs to be here, his steward Davin managing the throne's daily operations via messenger, his court in various states of confusion and frantic speculation. He did not explain himself to them. He managed the minimum necessary and spent the rest of his time in the guild city learning to do what he had not done in 17 years of rule. Wait, without knowing the outcome, without controlling the terms. One morning they found themselves walking along the river road east of the city. Not by plan, but because Alara was assessing the site for a possible future commission, and Rowan had offered to carry the survey equipment, which was heavy and awkward, and neither of them mentioned the absurdity of the Alpha King of the Iron Throne, hauling a level rod down a river road for a mechanical bonder who had not asked him to come. The river was low with the season. Stones were visible in the shallows. The air had the specific cold and clarity of late autumn, that quality of being washed clean of everything unessential. She stopped at a narrow crossing point and crouched to look at the bank erosion. And he crouched beside her, and they were very close, and she could feel the warmth of him the way she had at the workshop, and she was aware of his breathing, and she was aware of the bond being quiet in the particular way it was quiet when he was near. She looked at the bank. She measured. She took her notes. He was quiet beside her, not a performing quiet. Just there. Tell me something true, she said. She didn't look up from her notes, a pause. I was terrified, he said, in the hall. I saw you walk in and I felt the bond, and I was terrified. And I made the choice I made because I was terrified, and I have not said that to anyone because it didn't seem like a sufficient explanation. It isn't. He paused again, but it's true. She looked up then, at the river, not at him. The water moved over the stones, a sound like something being decided. I know, she said. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just. I know. He looked at the river too. And here is the thing about 2 people who have each carried a wound for over a year in opposite directions, and arrived unexpectedly at the same river on a cold autumn morning. There is a moment when the accumulated weight of pretending it isn't, there becomes greater than the weight of admitting it is. There is a tipping point. It is not romantic, usually. It is just a moment where the balance shifts. His hand was on the bank beside her. Her hand was not far. She looked at their hands. She looked at the river. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. She put her hand over his, just for a moment, just the span of a breath. Long enough to feel the warmth and the realness and the bond going so quiet it was almost silent. Then she stood up, picked up her survey notes, turned back toward the city. "The erosion is worse on the southern bank," she said. "It'll need reinforcing before any crossing structure is viable." He stood, picked up the level rod. "I'll note it," he said. And they walked back to the city in the specific silence of people who are carrying something new and have not yet decided what to call it. What brought it into public view was not his choosing. It was Lord Vale. Of course it was Lord Vale. Vale of the Eastern Marches, with his flat gray eyes and his habit of touching his ring, had been watching the Alpha King's extended absence from court with the attention of a man who had built his career on noticing what other people wanted, others not to notice. He arrived in Marin's Crossing on a pretext, a guild dispute, something about trade routes, and he brought his court clothes and his composed expression and his talent for saying things in public that could not be taken back. He found them at a guild dinner. Elara and Rowan were at opposite ends of the table, which was deliberate on her part, and which Vael noted with the quick calculation of someone who specialized in distances between people. He seated himself midway, where he could speak to both, and he waited until the dinner was well underway, and the wine had been present for an hour before he did it. "I recall you from the conclave, of course," he said, to Elara, pleasantly, conversationally, with the precise pleasantness of a man who knows exactly how the sentence is going to land. "Vethera settlement, wasn't it? A millwright's daughter?" He smiled. "It's remarkable what guild membership can accomplish." The table went quiet in the specific way of people who can feel a blade being drawn but haven't yet seen where it will land. Elara looked at Vale. Her hands were flat on the table. Her expression was the expression she had on the Lauren River Commission when the board asked their hostile questions. "Yes," she said, "Vethara settlement. Millwright's daughter." She looked at him directly. "I'm also cited twice in the Guild Quarterly as a practitioner of note. I have 8 completed commissions and a 9th in progress. I trained under Ossian of the Eastern Guild, and I passed the review board on first assessment." She picked up her wine cup, took a sip. "What is it you'd like to know about me, Lord Vale?" The table, which had been holding its breath, shifted. Someone on the far end made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. Vale's smile held, but it changed quality. The way metal changes quality when it meets something harder. "I meant no offense," he said. "I know," she said pleasantly. "Most people don't." She set down her cup. "The trade route dispute you're here about. Is it the crossing tariff or the Eastern Reach exemptions?" And she redirected the table, smoothly, into an entirely different conversation. And Vale spent the rest of the dinner in a conversation he had not planned to have. And Rowan, at the other end of the table, watched her do it with an expression the cloth seller at the market later described. When she told me about it, as a man recognizing something for the first time that he should have seen much earlier. After the dinner, he found her outside the guild hall. She was standing in the night air, and it was cold. First winter cold, the kind that smells of ice and coming dark, and she had her cloak, and she was looking up at whatever stars were available through the guild city's night sky. "Vale," he said. "Yes," she said, not elaborating. "I'm sorry he said that." "He's Vale," she said. "He said it for you to hear, not for me." She looked at him. Did it work? He looked at her steadily. No. She looked back at the sky. "Good," she said. He stood beside her in the cold. Their breath made the same shape in the dark air. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him again, that left side awareness, and she let herself have it this time without cataloging it, without taking its measure. "Elara," he said. "Yes, I want." He stopped. He was not a man who said, "I want." It cost him something, she could tell, just the two words. "I want to be here. Not to ask anything, not to negotiate anything. I want to be someone you are glad to know. Eventually, if that becomes possible." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the thing she'd seen in his face at the conclave, that fraction of a second before the mask came back. Except the mask wasn't there now. Just the man, long-jawed, white-streaked, the Alpha King who had made an irreversible mistake and had not tried to paper it over with language. "It might become possible," she said. "That's enough," he said. She almost said it then. The thing that was accumulating in her, the shift that had been happening over 2 months of market mornings and river roads and chalk diagrams on a planning board. She almost said it. Instead, she looked back at the sky. "It's cold," she said. "We should go in." He went in. She stayed one more moment, alone in the winter night, and let herself feel it. The bond quiet, the world slightly more present than it had been a week ago. The smell of ice and dark real and sharp in her chest. Then she went in. The question I had planted was never what the bond could do to them. The question I had planted, the one you have been carrying since the cold open, since she walked out of those doors, was what she would do when she held the power. Not if. When. Because I told you, at the beginning, this was a story of what he said, and what it cost him, and what she did with the wreckage. Here is what she did. The conclave met again in the spring, 5 years after the first. Marin's Crossing sent 3 guild representatives. Alara was one of them. Her commission on the Western River Road was complete. Cited in the Independent Settlements Trade Report as the most structurally effective mill restoration in the Eastern Territories in a decade. Talver's letter of testimony had been read into the guild record. She arrived at the Citadel with a leather satchel of tools and Bryn at her side, and a formal guild credential bearing the Eastern Guild's seal. And she walked through the gates without pausing. Rowan had returned to the throne 3 months prior. He had written to her, twice, careful letters, nothing that pressed. And she had written back, shorter. But she had written back. He had sat in his court and his muted world and done his work and thought about chalk diagrams and river roads and a hand over his on a cold bank. The conclave hall was the same. Torchlit, full. The pack lords and territorial alphas and warlords with their seats. All of them. And in the air, the particular tension of gathered power waiting to arrange itself. Alara took her seat with the guild representatives. 3rd row. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the front of the hall. Rowan was already there. Their eyes met across the hall. He held for a moment, then he stood. This is the thing nobody saw coming. Not Vale, who was 3 rows to the left with his ring and his flat gray eyes, already calculating angles. Not the pack lords. Not the warlord contingent from the south, who had arrived with specific territorial demands they intended to press. Not Davon, who had clasped hands in 17 years of steady service and who looked, for the first time in my memory, genuinely uncertain. Not even Alara. Rowan, the Alpha King of the Iron Throne, stepped down from the dais. He walked through the hall. People moved out of his way, not from deference, because deference moves at one's speed. And this was something faster, something that made people step back because they didn't know what they were watching. He walked the length of the hall, and he did not pause, and he did not slow, and when he reached the guild tables, he kept going until he was standing in front of her. She looked up at him. He lowered himself to one knee. The conclave hall went so quiet I could hear the torches. "Alara of Vithara," he said. His voice carried without effort, it always had. The Alpha King's voice, but with something underneath it that was only the man. "I rejected you in this hall. I let you be diminished in this hall. I did it in front of witnesses, and I did it with intent, and I have not, in the year since, been able to find a single honest justification for it. The hall was so still I could hear someone, far back, breathing. I am not asking to restore what I severed," he said. "Bonds that are broken by choice are not owed restoration. I know that. What I am asking. And here his voice changed, slightly, a change I had to work to name, and when I named it I found it was exposed. What I am asking is whether you would allow me to try. To build something from the ground, from equal ground, that is worth the name. Whether you would let me earn something I do not deserve to be given. He had both hands flat on the floor, not a suppliant's performance. A man's hands, flat on the stone. The hall waited. Every lord, every alpha. Vale, with his ring and his calculations, had gone perfectly still, and Alara looked at him. I watched her face in that moment, and what I saw was not triumph. I want to be precise about this. What I saw was someone who had spent 3 years in road dust and workshop fires, and hostile review boards, who had carried an ache in the shape of a rejection, who had built something real from wreckage, and was now looking at the man who had made the wreckage, and feeling, not triumph, not vindication, not the sweet relief of a wound finally acknowledged. Something quieter than that, something with more weight. She let the silence have a moment. Then she said, "Stand up." He stood. "Not here," she said. She said it quietly, only for him, which meant it was only for him and every person in the first 4 rows who had gone perfectly silent to hear. Not in this hall. This hall already has too much of our story in it. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "Come and find me. After." He looked at her. He swallowed. The single thing she had asked of him, in 3 months of walking beside each other, was equal ground. She was giving him that, even now. Especially now. "After," he said. She nodded once, and turned her attention to the front of the hall, to the formal proceedings that the conclave was supposed to be conducting, and she picked up her notes, and she was ready for the meeting. Around them, the hall, Hal slowly, Lee, cautiously, with the collective instinct of people who had just watched something they would describe for the rest of their lives, resumed. Vale touched his ring. Davin, at the side of the room, unclenched his hands. The torches kept burning. After, he found her in the Citadel's north courtyard, which was small and half-forgotten, a working courtyard with a well and a stone bench and the kind of plainness that meant no one had bothered to decorate it for visitors. She was there before him, sitting on the bench with her satchel between her feet, and when he came through the gate she looked up, and she did not stand, and she did not speak first. He sat beside her. Not too close, not with performance. He sat the way he had sat beside her on the riverbank, just there, just present. "Bryn is lobbying Ossian to let them apprentice full-time," she said. He blinked. A half-second recalibration. "Are they?" "Ossian is pretending to be undecided," Alara said. "She's already decided. She's just making Bryn defend it properly." A pause. "She thinks it builds character." "She's probably right," he said. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere above them, the hall was reconfiguring, its politics reshuffling around the public kneeling that would be processed and theorized and argued about for years. Vale would make his calculations. The northern lords would update their positions. Davin would do whatever Davin did, prepare, probably, for whatever came next with his clasped hands and his absolute precision. "I want to ask you something," Rowan said. She turned to look at him. "In the hall," he said, She stopped. "When you walked out, did any part of you hope that I would?" "No," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't hope anything," she said. "I stopped hoping in that hall, not as punishment. I looked at you, and you looked away, and I understood." She looked at the well in the center of the courtyard. "Hoping requires some belief that the person can surprise you. You had just told me very clearly who you were." He was very still. "And then you surprised me," she said. "Eventually." She looked back at him. "That's what I want you to understand. I didn't wait for you. I didn't build anything in anticipation of you. And when you showed up in Marin's Crossing—" "I know," he said. "No," she said. "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "When you showed up," she said, "I was angry. Not at you arriving. I was angry because the bond went quiet when you were nearby, and I had gotten used to carrying the ache, and I had made it into something that was mine. And then you showed up and it went quiet, and I resented that because it felt like my body making a decision I hadn't made yet. She paused. And then you were not what I expected, not what you were in the hall. You were something I hadn't prepared for, and that was more difficult than anything else would have been. A long pause, the well, the bench, the smell of old stone and early spring, and something blooming, faint, somewhere above the courtyard wall. Still angry, she said. Some of it, I want you to know that. It doesn't consume me, and it isn't all I feel, and it doesn't mean I have made a decision in either direction. But it's real, and I won't pretend it isn't. I don't want you to pretend anything, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. And this time there was something in how she said it that was different from the riverbank, from the workshop, from all the previous times she had said those two words. A door, slightly ajar. He felt it. She saw him feel it. The slight change in his breathing, the stillness that went different. The bond, she said. If it were to be remade, that's not a small thing. That's not an evening's decision. No, he agreed. And the throne, she said. The throne doesn't get a vote, he said. She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes. I made that mistake once, he said. I made the throne into a reason for a choice that was actually about fear. I won't do that again. The throne is my responsibility. It is not my excuse. She looked at him for a long time. The spring air moved through the courtyard. The faint bloom smell, whatever it was, something small, something with no ceremony about it, just alive. She reached into her satchel, pulled out a piece of chalk, looked at it, looked at the courtyard's stone wall. Come here, she said. He stood and came. She drew on the wall a quick diagram, load-bearing joints, connection points. The principle Ossian had taught her in year 1, that she had taught Bryn, that she had put in front of the review board with their clipboards and their skepticism. The strength is in the connection, not the components. The bond between things, made deliberately with understanding, carries more than either piece could carry alone. She looked at the diagram. That's what I'm willing to consider, she said. Not restoration, not reclaiming something that was broken, something built, deliberately, from the ground. She looked at him, if you understand the difference. He looked at the diagram, he looked at her. The white streak, the long jaw, the man underneath the Alpha King, which was the version that had surprised her. I understand the difference, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Measuring. Not the way she measured load-bearing structures, though there was something of that in it, that precision, that refusal to take the easy answer. Then she nodded once. Not a yes. Not a promise. A door. She put the chalk back in her satchel. There's a commission in the northern settlements, she said, standing. Starts in 2 weeks. I'll be gone for most of the season. I know, he said. She gave him a look that was almost amused. After the season, she said, we'll see. She picked up her satchel and walked toward the courtyard gate, and her walk was exactly what it had always been. Efficient, purposeful, the walk of a woman who knows where she is going. And at the gate she paused, just for a moment. She didn't look back, but she paused. Then she went through, and the gate closed behind her, and the sound it made was nothing like the sound the conclave hall doors had made. Quieter, more provisional. The sound of something that could open again. He stood in the courtyard with the chalk diagram on the wall, and the spring air and the faint small bloom smell, and the world was not restored, not healed, but slightly, incrementally, less muted than it had been. He looked at the diagram for a long time. Then he put one hand, flat, against the stone wall, beside the chalk lines, and, I tell you this because it is the truest thing I know to tell you, he stayed there. I have thought about this story for 30 years. I have turned it over the way you turn over something you found on the ground that might be nothing and might be significant, and you don't yet know which. I have tried to tell it in other ways, to find the version that is tidy, that wraps at the edges. There isn't one. Here is what I know. He stood in a hall full of witnesses and let her be diminished and called it politics. And the world went flat and the food went tasteless. And the green smell of rain on stone was taken from him. And none of it was punishment. It was just consequence, which is the way the universe works when it is paying attention. Here is what else I know. She walked out of those doors, and she did not look back, and she built something in the space he left, something load-bearing, something that was fully and entirely hers, and it was enough. She was enough. She had been enough from the beginning, walking 60 miles on foot with a split lip, enough before any commission or guild credential or letter of testimony. But she needed the years to know that herself, in the marrow, in a way that couldn't be argued with. What he got on that courtyard floor was not her forgiveness. Forgiveness was never the point. What he got was a door, slightly open, and the clear-eyed invitation to demonstrate, over time, what kind of man he intended to be. Not the alpha king, the man. On ground that was level. On terms she had named once and would not rename. Some doors only open from the side you slammed. He had spent a year learning that. She had spent a year becoming someone for whom it no longer needed to be true. And when she paused at the gate, just for a moment, without looking back, I think that was the realest thing I ever saw. Not a beginning, not a forgiveness. Just a woman who had earned the right to pause, and did, and chose what came next for herself, and walked into the spring with the answer still in her keeping.